Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is HarrisX founder and CEO, Dritan Nesho. Dritan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me again, Brittany.
Surprise to no one, we are sitting here 3 weeks out of an extremely close election, and I want to talk about the latest numbers coming from a new Harvard Caps Harris poll. It's showing a tight race. What are you seeing?
Well, let me take a step back and sort of describe the polls. So, over the course of the last 3 or 4 days, we were in field and we interviewed 3,100, over 3,100 registered voters, including over 2,600 likely voters, those who are saying that they will very likely vote in the election, and then also 900 voters or close to 900 voters from battleground states. So this is a super poll or a super sample, as you usually do heading into the final stretch. And simply put, it shows that Harris has momentum going into election day, and that momentum is reflected especially in the early voting, where she's up by over 8 points in terms of the early voting. But while kind of on a national level, Harris is up by 1.47%, to be very, very exact. And incidentally, that's exactly what the Real Clear poll of polls, or average of all polls, has her ahead. Trump actually flips it within the battleground states and with swing voters within those states. So actually, amongst the battleground voters, Trump is up by 2 points. So it's going to be a very, very tight election, right? Harris has the momentum, but Trump still has the advantage within those battleground states. And it's going to come down to this last 25 days and who's able to close the best, right? And convince voters to vote for them.
I want to talk about what you're describing as that Trump advantage in the battleground states. As we've all talked about for months, this election is really coming down to those 7 key swing states. And is the positive polling for Harris nationally versus the battleground states simply because Donald Trump is targeting these swing states more?
Well, the election will come down to these swing states, right? The ultimately, it's less about the popular vote than it is about how the popular vote translates in the electoral college. And so when we look at the battleground state voters, we really focused on Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, right? And these are the states that will likely, and North Carolina, and these are the states that will likely make the difference in this election year. And again, it's a slightly different picture between the national polling, where Harris is up between 1 to 2 points, and again, these battleground states where voters are still sticking with Trump. And really, the big difference is not in terms of how Republicans or Democrats are voting. They're both sticking with their candidates roughly in the same proportion, but it's really independents. Harris wins independents nationally, or in our national sample. They're breaking in her favor, and Trump actually is winning independents in the battleground states. And those independents are breaking in Trump's favor within the battleground states. So it's ultimately about that voter in the middle, which you and I have talked about many times now. It's going to come down to that voter in the middle and the decision that those voters make.
Let's talk about the numbers here. When we're looking at the national polls versus when we're looking at battleground specific polls, what are you seeing when it comes to the demographic, and how are they changing?
Sure. Well, nationally, as would be expected, Trump is winning the male vote. Harris is winning the female vote. Harris is winning the low education vote, those with less than a high school degree, and those with college or more. And Trump is winning the voters in the middle. And again, education is a proxy for whether you are on the lower class, middle class, or upper class professional class. So you could say that Trump is winning those middle class voters across the country. And then Trump is up by 11 points with white voters. Harris is up with black voters as expected, but she's underperforming Biden's performance with black voters in 2020. And what I mean by that is that Biden carried about 90% of black voters in 2020. Harris in the poll is winning 67% of those black voters. Trump is winning 26%. Do I think that 26% is a little bit high for Trump? Yes. I think that as those undecided black voters, is about 7% of them, make up their mind, they're much more likely to go for Harris. And, Trump might be polling a little bit better than what he'll get. But there is some alarms that are going off here with black voters. And you saw even as recently as this weekend, former President Obama on the stump basically called out the problems that the Harris campaign is having with black males, right? And that they're not showing the enthusiasm amongst black males and really them coming out and voting as much. And then just to tie a bow on it, I mean, Trump is doing fairly well with Hispanics. He's at 37%. There's room to grow there, and 9% of Hispanics still remain undecided. Harris is winning about 54% of Hispanics. So again, Trump is performing very well with Hispanics, and that can make a meaningful difference as Hispanics make up their mind. And then Trump is winning the rural vote, 57% for Trump, 36% for Harris, 7% undecided. They're splitting the suburban vote, interestingly enough, especially given the advantage that Harris has with women. So Harris is at 48% in the suburban vote. Trump is at 47%, and 5% remain undecided. And then, as expected, urban areas tend to be more liberal. They tend to break Democratic. So Harris is winning urban areas by 55% to 34%. And I'll put a final point here, which is amongst voters who have already made up their mind, Trump and Harris are tied 49% to 49%, with only about 1% which are unsure. Amongst those who are still weighing their choices, Harris has an 11-point advantage. She's at 39%, Trump is at 28%, and the unsure are about 33%. So this is how the polling is breaking out at the national level, and there's very few differences between all registered voters and those who say that they're very likely to vote in the election. These numbers change maybe by 1 percentage point or less. But the battleground states are a slightly different story, right? And that's where Trump starts showing that he has the edge.
I do want to talk about those battleground states, but first, you touched on those voters who have yet to make up their mind. How many of those voters are there as we sit here just 3 weeks away from Election Day? And is that number higher than you would expect? Is it unprecedented? What does that look like when you compare it to elections past?
It's about 14% where we stand today. So these are all the swing voters in the system, and roughly about 10% of voters in each of the party within each of the parties say that they can still change their mind. This is roughly tracking with what we've seen in previous elections. And then in terms of the undecideds, that's where the undecideds have come down fairly significantly since the last time you and I spoke. The last time there was about 10%, maybe even more, 12% that were undecided. And now the number has been cut in half to about 6%. But the important point here is that there's enough voters that are undecided that can tip the scales for the election. So the last 20, 25 days, it's very important. And it will be very important for both of the campaigns to close Trump.
And if you're an undecided, are you deciding between Trump and Harris? Are you deciding between one of the candidates and the couch? Are you deciding between Trump and Harris and a third-party candidate? What does that decision-making process look like?
Well, it seems like they're deciding between the two candidates, right? And what we're seeing in the data is that while this election might not be as high turnout as 2020, which was a very high turnout election, it's still very high turnout overall. So 90% of all registered voters are saying that they're definitely going to vote or they're probably going to vote. And the definite number is about 81% of voters. That is 85% of Democrats, 84% of Republicans, and about 72% of independents. And then those who are probable are about 10% for each of the parties. So these are not the couch potato voters. You make a great point that historically Trump has been able to pull new voters into the voting pool. Traditionally, those are not the kind of voters that take surveys. So that could be a wild card in the election. But at the same time, also new voters, young voters that are voting for the first time. Those are also voters that are not likely to take polls on the regular, and they could be the wild card too. So it's an open election. There's many factors that can influence it one way or another.
You and I now for months have been talking about the independent voter, and as these numbers suggest now, Trump has a real advantage with these independent voters in the battleground states. Can you give us a clearer picture here?
Absolutely. So Trump is up 4 to 5 points with independent voters in battleground states, 44% and change to Harris is 40%. Importantly, 16% of independents in battleground states are still on the fence. These are voters who are unsure that they're going to vote for. So that's 3 times higher than the national average, again, for independents in battleground states. And as we said, this is very, very likely to make the difference in the election. Otherwise, the candidates, they're really tracking as you would expect them. You know, Trump is up about 13 points with men in these battleground states. Harris is up about 9 points with women. And the picture amongst voters in terms of Harris winning the lower income voters and is the same. They're tied actually for higher educated, higher income voters, 49% to 49, and then Trump is still winning those middle class voters, 51% to 43%. But as I said again, the amount of undecideds is still very high, even in the battleground states. And you know, we ran a series of questions, which I'll get into in a second, around character attributes and how the candidates are doing with voters in the final stretch. And one of the things that's very poignant is that Harris does well on the question of who relates to the voting class. She's more relatable to the working class rather than the voting class, working class, than Trump is. She's at about 51%, he's at about 40%. So again, when it comes to those undecideds and those swing voters, it could still go either way.
Talk about that a little more. What do you think, based on these numbers, that this election is going to come down to? Is it going to come down to that character? Is it going to come down to the top issues? What does that look like?
Well, each of the candidates have their core strengths, and frankly, they've consolidated their core strengths, right? So Trump is seen on the aggregate as someone who will get things done. He outperforms Harris on that, who understands the economy, again, does well. He's seen as a fighter. He's seen as someone who understands foreign policy. And by a double-digit margin or a delta of over 10 points, he's seen as having the experience to be president. However, Harris has had a very strong introduction, and she's seen as having the right temperament for president. She's plus 15 points on that specific attribute. She's seen as having the right values, 8 points over Trump, caring about people like me, 8 points over Trump. Again, voters said 48% that Harris cares about people like them, and 40% answered the same for Trump, with 12 being unsure. And she's also seen as representing change. So when we say that she has momentum, that's really what we mean, right? That she has communicated to voters that she could be president and they see her as being good enough, and she's seen as a breath of fresh air. Where Trump dominates Harris is more on the issues, on everything from improving the economy and creating jobs to reducing inflation to national security and foreign policy, immigration, and so on and so forth, the military, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Hamas war. He wins over her in double digits. And he is seen as being more experienced and more capable across a broader range of issues than she is. Harris is mainly winning on abortion, healthcare, race, equity, helping the working class, education, and climate change, which really are core democratic issues to begin with. So again, it's a complex picture and very dynamic and very competitive. An election like this, it's very susceptible to an October surprise, and we'll see if there will be an October surprise, whether domestically or in terms of foreign policy.
I'm sure you and I will be talking if there is any and all, or if we see any and all October surprises. But the top issues are inflation and price increases, the economy, as well as immigration. So Trump, you're saying, has the advantage there, but Harris has the momentum. And 3 weeks from Election Day, what would you rather have, the momentum going to the polls or the advantage?
It's a wonderful question. Um, it's very difficult to answer it. And I would say that uh, what is important is paying close attention to the 7% of the electorate, 6 or 7% of the electorate who are on the fence, and then the swing voters, and seeing how the polls track and trend as that gap narrow, as more people make up their mind. But it's a very difficult question to answer whether it's the Harris's momentum that's worth more or Trump's strength in the battleground state. What we know for a fact is that the election is going to come down to the results in a few different states. It might come down even to one state, in my opinion. That state is Pennsylvania. So we'll see sort of what happens in that cocktail between momentum and advantage.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for, and I'm sure you and I will have plenty of conversations in the 3 weeks leading up to Election Day. Dritan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.